Lorenzo Zimmerman had built everything from nothing. 43 years of 16-hour days, missed family dinners, and sacrificed weekends had created a business empire worth $37 million. But as he lay in his mahogany bed, gray morning light filtering through silk curtains, listening to his eldest son, Preston, arguing with his brother Carter about inheritance divisions in the hallway outside his bedroom, Lorenzo realized a devastating truth. The family he had worked himself to exhaustion for saw him as nothing more than a walking bank account waiting to expire. The sound of their voices, sharp with greed and impatience, cut deeper than any physical pain ever could. Welcome to my channel, where I share real stories with unexpected twists. If you like what you hear, please hit subscribe and give me a thumbs up. It really means a lot to me. Now, let's begin this story. Lorenzo Zimmerman sat in his leather office chair, staring at the framed photograph on his desk. His late wife, Elena, smiled back at him, her arm wrapped around their 4 children during last Christmas, before the cancer took her 6 months ago. The silence in the mansion felt different now, heavier somehow, filled with an uncomfortable tension he could not quite name. At 68, Lorenzo had everything most men dreamed of. His construction company employed over 200 people across 3 states. The Georgian mansion in Buckhead, Atlanta, housed 6 bedrooms, a wine cellar, and grounds that required 3 full-time gardeners. His children had attended private schools, graduated from prestigious universities, and never wanted for anything. But something had shifted since Elena's funeral. Preston, his 35-year-old eldest son, had started asking pointed questions about the business succession plan. Carter, 32, kept making comments about the expensive upkeep on properties that were just sitting there doing nothing. Even his daughter-in-law, Vera, had begun dropping hints about how difficult it must be for Lorenzo to manage such a large estate all alone. Only Willow, his 26-year-old youngest daughter, seemed unchanged. She still called every evening, still brought homemade soup when he mentioned feeling tired, still listened to his stories about building the company, with the same interest she had shown as a child. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in November. Lorenzo had invited the family for dinner, hoping to recapture some of the warmth they had shared when Elena was alive. Instead, he found himself listening to Preston and Carter debate the merits of selling the vacation house in Hilton Head. "Dad's not getting any younger," Preston said, cutting his steak with unnecessary force. "When was the last time anyone used that place?" Carter nodded enthusiastically. "The property taxes alone are killing us. We could get at least $2.5 million for it in this market." Lorenzo set down his fork, the sound sharp against the china. "Us? When did my property become ours to discuss?" An uncomfortable silence settled over the dining room. Vera studied her wine glass. Carter cleared his throat. Preston straightened in his chair, his face reddening slightly. "We're just thinking practically, Dad," Preston said carefully. "You've worked so hard all your life. Maybe it's time to simplify things." The words hung in the air like smoke. Lorenzo looked around the table at faces that suddenly seemed like strangers. These were his children, people he had loved and provided for without question, and they were discussing his life as if he were already gone. That night, alone in his study, Lorenzo made a decision that would change everything. He picked up his phone and dialed two numbers. First, his longtime attorney, Harrison Stone, then his personal physician, Dr. Xavier Coleman. Within an hour, both men sat in leather chairs across from Lorenzo's desk, their faces serious in the lamplight. "I need to know who truly loves me," Lorenzo said quietly. "Not my money, not my properties, not what I can provide. Me." Harrison leaned forward, his silver eyebrows raised. "What exactly are you proposing?" Lorenzo's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "I want to pretend I'm dying, something serious, terminal. I want to see how my family reacts when they think the money is coming soon." Dr. Coleman shifted uncomfortably. "Lorenzo, that's quite an elaborate deception." "Elaborate, yes, but necessary." Lorenzo's eyes were hard now, the look that had intimidated competitors and closed million-dollar deals. Elena always said people show their true nature when they think no one is watching. Well, I need to watch. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll need to protect your assets first. We should move significant portions into accounts they cannot access, just in case." Dr. Coleman sighed deeply. "What kind of condition are we talking about?" "Pancreatic cancer," Lorenzo said without hesitation. "Advanced stage, 6 months to live." The two men exchanged glances. Harrison pulled out his legal pad and began taking notes. Dr. Coleman removed his glasses and cleaned them with his shirt, a nervous habit Lorenzo remembered from 20 years of annual checkups. "This could backfire spectacularly," the doctor warned. Lorenzo looked again at Elena's photograph on his desk. Her smile seemed to encourage him, as it had during every difficult business decision he had ever made. "Or it could save me from a lifetime of wondering whether anyone loved me for who I am." By midnight, the plan was set. Harrison would discreetly move $18 million into protected accounts. Dr. Coleman would deliver the devastating diagnosis to the family within the week, and Lorenzo would begin the most important performance of his life. As his co-conspirators left through the back entrance, Lorenzo stood at his bedroom window, watching their headlights disappear down the long driveway. The November air was crisp against the glass, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of wind chimes Elena had hung from the oak tree years ago. Tomorrow, he would begin coughing. By Thursday, he would complain of stomach pain. By the weekend, he would be too weak to leave his room. And then, he would discover what his children really thought about their father. Sometimes the most important truths require the most painful methods to uncover. The transformation began gradually, just as Lorenzo had planned. Monday morning, he coughed during breakfast. Tuesday, he picked at his food, claiming his stomach felt unsettled. By Wednesday, Vera noticed he looked pale and suggested he see Dr. Coleman. The appointment was scheduled for Friday morning. Lorenzo arrived at the medical office building on Peachtree Street, his performance already in full swing. He had lost weight deliberately, eating only small portions for days. His clothes hung loose on his normally robust frame. Dr. Coleman played his part perfectly. The examination room felt cold and sterile as he performed unnecessary tests, his face growing increasingly grave with each procedure. When Lorenzo's family gathered in the consultation room that afternoon, the doctor's expression told them everything before he spoke a word. "I'm afraid I have difficult news," Dr. Coleman began, his voice heavy with practiced sorrow. "The tests show advanced pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The silence that followed was deafening. Vera gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Carter went completely still, his face draining of color. Preston leaned forward in his chair, his businessman's mind already processing the implications. Only Willow moved. She rushed to Lorenzo's side, taking his hand in both of hers, tears streaming down her face. "How long?" Preston asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "With aggressive treatment, perhaps 8 to 10 months. Without it." Dr. Coleman shrugged sadly. 6 months, maybe less. Lorenzo watched his family's reactions carefully. Vera was crying now, but something in her eyes looked almost calculating. Carter seemed shocked, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something that made Lorenzo's stomach turn. Preston's face had gone completely expressionless, the way it did during difficult business negotiations. The drive home passed in unusual quiet. Lorenzo sat in the passenger seat of Preston's BMW, pretending to be too weak to drive himself. Through the window, Atlanta's skyline blurred past, the city he had helped build looking suddenly foreign and distant. That evening, Lorenzo retreated to his bedroom, claiming exhaustion. But the walls in the old mansion were thick, not soundproof. From his bed, he could hear voices drifting up from the kitchen below. At first, the words were indistinct, but as the conversation grew more animated, he began to make out specific phrases. "Have to be practical. Have to be about this. The company alone is worth at least 20 million. Properties will need to be liquidated quickly." Lorenzo's heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. These were his children, discussing his death as if it were a business opportunity. He pressed his ear closer to the floor, desperate to hear more, dreading what he might discover. Preston's voice carried clearly now. "We need a clear succession plan. Dad never wanted to talk about it when he was healthy, but now we don't have a choice." Carter's response was equally clear. "The vacation properties will be the easiest to sell. The Hilton Head House, the cabin in North Carolina, maybe even the lake house in Lanier. What about the Atlanta properties?" Vera's voice joined the conversation. "The downtown office building is probably worth 8 million on its own." Lorenzo felt nauseous, but not from any illness. These people were cataloging his life's work like items at an estate sale. Worse, they were doing it while he was still alive, still breathing, still able to hear every word. Over the following weeks, the family's behavior shifted dramatically. The initial shock and grief gave way to something far more disturbing. Preston began spending hours in Lorenzo's home office, going through files and business documents under the pretense of helping manage affairs. Carter started making inquiries about property values, claiming he wanted to understand the family's financial position. Even more painful was what Lorenzo did not see. His children's visits became shorter and less frequent. Vera stopped bringing her usual homemade casseroles, saying the smell of cooking made her too sad. Carter canceled their traditional monthly lunch meetings, claiming he needed time to process the news. Only Willow remained constant. She moved back into her childhood bedroom, claiming she wanted to spend as much time as possible with her father. Every morning, she brought him breakfast in bed. Every evening, she sat beside him, reading aloud from books he had enjoyed when she was young. But even Willow's devotion could not protect Lorenzo from the growing evidence of his family's true nature. One afternoon, while pretending to nap, he overheard Preston on the phone in the hallway. "We need to move quickly on this. Dad's getting weaker every day, and we cannot afford to have the business suffer during the transition." The conversation continued, but Lorenzo had heard enough. His eldest son, the child he had groomed to take over the company, was already planning his corporate funeral. That night, Harrison Stone visited the mansion under cover of darkness. Lorenzo met him in the study, both men speaking in whispers. "How are you holding up?" Harrison asked, his weathered face creased with concern. Lorenzo sank into his leather chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 68 years. "It's worse than I imagined. They're not grieving, Harrison. They're planning." The attorney nodded, grimly. "I've been monitoring the accounts you asked me to watch. Preston has been making inquiries about liquidating some of your stock holdings. Carter called my office asking about property transfer procedures." "And Willow?" "Nothing. She hasn't made a single financial inquiry or asked about inheritance details. She seems to be the only one who's actually concerned about you, not your money." Lorenzo stared at Elena's photograph on his desk. In the lamplight, her smile seemed sadder somehow, as if she too was disappointed by their children's behavior. "What happens next?" Harrison asked gently. Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment, listening to the old house settle around them. Somewhere upstairs, he could hear Willow moving around in her room, probably preparing for another night of caring for her supposedly dying father. "We continue," Lorenzo said finally. "I need to see how far they'll go. I need to know if there's anything left worth saving in this family." Harrison gathered his papers and stood to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back at his longtime friend. "Lorenzo, some truths are too painful to bear. Are you sure you want to know how this ends?" Lorenzo met his gaze steadily. "I've spent my entire life building something to leave behind for my children. If they don't deserve it, I need to know that too." After Harrison left, Lorenzo sat alone in his study until dawn broke over Atlanta. The house was silent around him, but his mind was chaos. Everything he had believed about his family was crumbling, and he was powerless to stop it. The hardest problems are often the ones we create ourselves. By December, Lorenzo's supposed condition had deteriorated significantly, according to the performance he maintained daily. He stayed in bed most mornings, spoke in whispers, and allowed Willow to help him with simple tasks like buttoning his shirts. The act had become so convincing that sometimes, in quiet moments, he almost believed it himself. The family's behavior had grown increasingly disturbing. Preston now spent more time at Lorenzo's office than at his own apartment, claiming he needed to understand the business operations before the inevitable transition. Carter had started bringing potential buyers to view the vacation properties, telling them his father was too ill to be consulted. But it was what happened on a cold Tuesday evening in mid-December that finally shattered Lorenzo's faith completely. Willow had gone to the pharmacy to pick up medications that Lorenzo did not actually need, but had to maintain for appearances. The house felt empty, without her gentle presence, and Lorenzo was dozing in his bedroom when he heard familiar voices downstairs. Through the heating vents, Preston and Carter's conversation drifted up clearly. "The sooner this is over, the better," Preston was saying. "Watching him waste away like this is torture." "At least he's not suffering," Carter replied. "Doc Coleman says it'll be peaceful when the time comes." Lorenzo's blood went cold. They were discussing his death as if it were an appointment on their calendars, something to be endured and completed. But worse was yet to come. The front door opened, and Lorenzo heard Vera's voice joining the conversation. What she said next made his heart stop completely. "I ran into that contractor friend of yours today, Carter. The one who's been asking about the lake house renovation project. He's very interested in purchasing it as is." "How much did he offer?" Preston asked immediately. $2.2 million, cash." There was a moment of silence, then Carter spoke again. "That's below market value, but if it's cash and closes quickly." "Dad specifically said he wanted to keep that house," Vera said, but her tone suggested this was a minor inconvenience rather than a sacred wish. Preston's response was swift and cold. "Dad said a lot of things when he was healthy. The situation has changed." Lorenzo felt something die inside his chest. The lake house had been Elena's favorite place on earth. They had honeymooned there 37 years ago, had taken the children there every summer, had planned to retire there together. It was the one property he had explicitly told his family never to sell, no matter what happened to him, and they were discussing it like a stock portfolio asset. But the evening held one more devastating revelation. Around 10 o'clock, Lorenzo heard a car pull into the driveway. Through his bedroom window, he watched a red sports car park near the garden entrance. A young man got out, someone Lorenzo did not recognize. Minutes later, he heard Vera's voice in the hallway, speaking in hushed, excited tones. The conversation moved toward the guest wing of the house, away from Lorenzo's bedroom. But old habits from his construction days had given him sharp hearing, and the vent system carried sound in unexpected ways. What he heard next made him wish he had never started this terrible experiment. Vera was not just planning to sell his properties. She was having an affair. While her husband lay dying upstairs, she was entertaining another man in his own house. Lorenzo closed his eyes and felt tears squeeze out between the lids for the first time since Elena's funeral. The family he had sacrificed everything for had not just abandoned him emotionally. They had betrayed him completely. When Willow returned from the pharmacy an hour later, she found Lorenzo sitting up in bed, staring at the wall with an expression she had never seen before. "Dad, are you okay? You look different." Lorenzo turned to look at his youngest daughter, this girl who had given up her own life to care for him during his supposed final months. Her face was full of genuine concern, her eyes bright with unshed tears of worry. "Willow," he said quietly, "sit down. I need to tell you something." She settled into the chair beside his bed, taking his hand in hers just as she had every night for weeks. "I'm not dying," Lorenzo said simply. Willow blinked, confusion spreading across her features. "What do you mean?" "I'm not sick. I don't have cancer. Dr. Coleman and Attorney Stone helped me create this situation because I needed to know who in this family truly loved me." The words hung in the air between them. Willow's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, understanding, and finally, something that looked like relief mixed with anger. "You've been pretending this entire time?" Lorenzo nodded, watching her face carefully. I suspected that your brothers and stepmother saw me as nothing more than a source of money. I needed to know the truth. Willow was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but sad. And what did you learn? Lorenzo's voice broke slightly as he answered. That I was right to suspect them, and that I was blessed beyond measure to have one child who loves me for who I am. Willow began to cry then, but they were tears of relief rather than grief. She threw her arms around her father's neck, holding him tightly. I knew something felt wrong, she whispered. You seemed too aware, too strong for someone so sick. But I didn't care. Even if you were dying, I wanted to be here. Lorenzo held his daughter and felt something broken inside his chest begin to heal. In a house full of people who had betrayed him, one person had chosen love over greed, presence over convenience, sacrifice over selfishness. Over the next hour, Lorenzo told Willow everything he had observed and overheard. Her face grew sadder with each revelation, but she was not surprised. She had noticed the changes in her brother's behavior, had seen the calculating looks in Vera's eyes. What happens now? She asked finally. Lorenzo's expression hardened, returning to the steel that had built his business empire. Now we finish this. Tomorrow, I want you to call everyone together. Tell them I want to have a family meeting. Tell them I have something important to say about my will. And then? Then they'll learn that actions have consequences. And you'll learn that love is never wasted, even when it stands alone. As they sat together in the lamplight, Lorenzo felt a peace he had not experienced in years. He had lost his illusions about his family, but he had found something far more valuable. He had discovered that authentic love existed, even in the darkest circumstances. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what matters. The family gathered in Lorenzo's study the next evening, thinking they were coming to hear a dying man's final wishes. Preston wore his most somber suit. Carter carried a legal pad, ready to take notes. Vera arrived with red-rimmed eyes that Lorenzo now suspected had more to do with her secret relationship than grief. Only Willow seemed calm, standing beside her father's chair like a guardian angel. Harrison Stone sat in the corner with his briefcase, having been summoned for what the family assumed would be the reading of a will. Dr. Coleman stood near the window, his face grave and professional. Lorenzo looked around the room at faces he had loved for decades, people who had shared his table, his home, his life. The knowledge of their betrayal sat heavy in his chest, but alongside it was a strange sense of freedom. I asked you all here tonight because I have something important to tell you, Lorenzo began, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Preston leaned forward attentively. Carter poised his pen over the legal pad. Vera dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. I'm not dying, Lorenzo said simply. The silence that followed was profound. Preston's mouth fell open. Carter's pen clattered to the floor. Vera went completely still, her tissue halfway to her face. I never had cancer. Dr. Coleman and Attorney Stone helped me stage this entire situation because I needed to know who in this family truly loved me and who saw me as nothing more than a bank account waiting to be closed. Preston found his voice first. Dad, what are you saying? Lorenzo's eyes were hard now, the warmth completely gone. I'm saying I've spent the last 2 months listening to you plan my estate sale while I was supposedly dying upstairs. I've watched you calculate property values, contact buyers, and discuss liquidating my life's work as if I were already in the ground. Carter tried to speak, but Lorenzo held up his hand. Carter, you've been showing the lake house to potential buyers. The lake house where your mother and I honeymooned, where we took you children every summer, where she specifically asked to have her ashes scattered. You were ready to sell our memories for cash. Carter's face had gone pale. Dad, I was just trying to help prepare for what? For my death? You seemed remarkably eager for that preparation. Lorenzo turned to Preston. And you, Preston, my firstborn son, the child I groomed to take over the business. You've been in my office every day, going through files, making calls, planning a transition that you hoped would come sooner rather than later. Preston's composure cracked. I was trying to protect the business. Were you? Or were you protecting your inheritance? Finally, Lorenzo's gaze settled on Vera. And you. While I lay upstairs, supposedly dying, you brought another man into my house, into the home I built for this family. Vera's face went white. The tissue dropped from her nerveless fingers. I heard everything. I saw everything. I know exactly who each of you really are when you think no one is watching. The room erupted in voices, protests, denials, desperate explanations. But Lorenzo raised his hand again, and something in his expression silenced them all. Harrison, Lorenzo said quietly, please explain the changes we've made. The attorney stood, opening his briefcase with deliberate calm. Over the past 2 months, we've moved $18 million of your father's assets into protected accounts. We've also documented every attempt to liquidate properties and every financial inquiry made by family members. Lorenzo continued. Preston, Carter, the properties you've been so eager to sell were never yours to sell. They remain mine, and after what I've witnessed, they always will. He turned to address each of them individually. Preston, you're no longer welcome in my business. Carter, the same applies to you. I'll be changing my will to reflect what I've learned about your character. And Vera, Lorenzo's voice grew even colder. You have 24 hours to leave my house, permanently. The protests began again, louder this time, desperate, but Lorenzo was not finished. However, he said, looking at Willow, there is one person in this room who showed me what love actually looks like. Willow gave up her own life to care for what she thought was a dying father. She never asked about money, never inquired about inheritance, never calculated the value of my suffering. Lorenzo stood up, stronger and more vital than he had appeared in months. Everything I have worked for, everything I have built, will go to the one person who loved me without condition. Harrison opened a folder. I have the new will here, dated yesterday. Willow Martinez Zimmerman is now the sole beneficiary of your father's estate. The silence that followed was different from before. It was the silence of consequences settling like dust after an explosion. Preston tried one last time. Dad, we can talk about this. We can work things out. Lorenzo looked at his eldest son with infinite sadness. Preston, the time for talking was these past 2 months, when you thought I was dying. You showed me then who you really are. I believe you. Over the following months, Lorenzo discovered that his drastic action had been the right choice. Preston and Carter struggled initially, but eventually found their own paths, learning to work without the safety net of inherited wealth. The experience humbled them in ways that privilege never could. Vera disappeared entirely, leaving no forwarding address. But Willow thrived. She took over the business with a combination of her father's strategic mind and her mother's compassionate heart. Under her leadership, the company not only survived, but expanded, creating jobs and opportunities throughout Atlanta. Lorenzo lived to see his grandchildren born, watched Willow marry a man who loved her for her character rather than her wealth, and experienced the joy of a family built on genuine affection rather than financial obligation. Years later, sitting in the same study where he had planned his elaborate test, Lorenzo often reflected on that difficult period. The pain of discovering his family's true nature had been devastating, but it had also been liberating. He had learned that love cannot be bought, demanded, or assumed. It can only be recognized when it appears naturally, without expectation of reward. Most importantly, he had learned that one authentic relationship is worth more than a dozen convenient ones. The strongest families are not built on wealth or obligation, but on the simple choice to love without condition, especially when times get difficult. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever questioned whether people love you for who you are or what you can provide? Share your experiences with our community. And if you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our weekly uploads. Until next time, remember that true love always reveals itself through actions, not words.